today's conversation centers around cognitive health, both the looming crisis at hand as America ages and the role that digital health solutions can play in early detection and monitoring of cognitive decline, and even in reducing the risk of Alzheimer's. We have a variety of perspectives to weigh in on the topic, so should be a really great conversation. For those of you who may be less familiar with Rock Health, we are an early stage digital health venture fund investing in solutions that make healthcare massively better. If you're a digital health startup seeking investment, or you're an investor that may be interested in chatting, definitely reach out to us at hello@rockhealth.com. We also have an advisory services business. So we're empowering healthcare leaders at enterprise scale healthcare and non-healthcare companies, giving them the knowledge, resources, community that those large entities need to navigate digital health innovation. So if you're an enterprise leader interested in learning more, please reach out to us at advisoryservices@rockhealth.com, and we'd be happy to chat. A few housekeeping items before we get started. So we will be taking questions throughout the conversation. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. And we also have a chat box. So if you want to react, comment, interact with your fellow attendees, go ahead and do that in the chat box. If at any point you run into issues with your audio or video, please email hello@rockhealth.com and we will go ahead and try to resolve your issue. Okay, so we are going to dive in with introductions, and I had asked our participants, we'll just do a quick round of who you are, what you are currently up to, and we're going to ask everyone to share a fun fact, and I'll share my fun fact after you guys go. But Elli would love to kick things off with you.
Thank you, Megan. I'm Elli Kaplan. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Neurotrack. Neurotrack is a digital health company based in the Bay Area. We are a Rock Health portfolio company, and we are commercializing an end-to-end platform to assess and then monitor and strengthen one's cognition or brain health. Our technology is rooted in our deep science and utilizes eye tracking at its core. And brain health is really the foundation of our company's clinical method for early detection, action, and prevention, empowering individuals to take control of their cognitive health as they would their physical health. We work in Japan and the US with large insurance companies, as well as in healthcare, broadly speaking. I would say it's more of an interesting fact, which is that I spent the first almost 12 years of my life living in on or near Native American reservations in Oklahoma and Washington State, where my dad was a pediatrician with the Indian Health Service. And this experience really deeply shaped my views on healthcare and the importance of access to quality care for everyone. So I will turn it back to you now.
I love that. I love that connection. Thanks for sharing. Christina, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristina Malzbender, and I'm an Associate Director of Health and Life Sciences at Gates Ventures. Gates Ventures is the private office of Mr. Bill Gates. And so I focus on our portfolio of initiatives and philanthropic work focused on Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So my fun fact is, a couple of years ago, while on vacation in Portugal, my family and I brought home a dog that we found on the side of the road. And it was shockingly easy to bring a dog to the United States, and she's now the smallest but loudest member of our family.
I love that. I feel like there's been a lot of pet adoption, especially happening over the last few months. I've thought about it, haven't pulled the trigger because we already have a dog in the house, but we shall see. Wen, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to join you in today's discussion. So I'm Wen Dombrowski. I'm a geriatrics physician and a technologist, and I've worked at the front lines of senior care, health innovation, and tech startups. My company, Catalaize, we work with Fortune 50 companies and healthcare organizations to help them develop and adopt new technologies, AI and machine learning, and also enterprise tech, consumer tech, as well as tech-enabled services. Additionally, in addition to the corporate and enterprise portfolio, we also work with a variety of startup companies to really accelerate their industry knowledge and their product strategy. So over the years, my company has worked with several brain health startups, and each in their own way has automated cognitive assessments or interventions. For example, there's some that have digital versions of industry standard neuropsychological tests that are gains that have been validated in research studies funded by the NIH. So I'm excited to be here today. And one of the reasons why I'm really interested in digital tools for cognitive health is because as a clinician specialized in geriatric medicine, which is the care of older adults, I've seen, one, how time consuming it is for PCPs to be able to assess their patient's cognition, and it's often very subjective. And then on the other hand, there's the lack of access to neuropsychologists, neurologists, and other specialists. And oftentimes patients have to wait over, half a year just to get a simple evaluation. So I'm excited about today's discussion. And last but not least, I wanted to mention, prior to becoming a physician, I used to work in assisted living facilities as a care manager in the dementia unit. So it's basically like spending 16 hours a day as the sole caregiver for multiple dementia residents in their home environment. And it was incredibly eye-opening to just see firsthand, like, what were the challenges as well as the strengths of people with dementia. So with that, my fun fact is I love to dance, and I've taught Bollywood dancing at the Senior Center before.
I love that so much. I have a friend who does kind of Bollywood fitness, and I tried a class, and it requires a ton of coordination. So kudos to you. When I will say, if you could just stay close to your mic, I think when you're leaning back, it may be going a little bit in and out. It's a little funny because I feel like your background is has deep sea vibes, but I think when you lean back, it sounds a little bit like you're underwater. So if you could just stay close, that would be awesome. My fun fact is actually sitting next to me. So earlier in the year, we had done kind of a team bonding event at a kind of do-it-yourself pottery place, and we just got our pottery back, actually. I came to the office just to have better Wi-Fi, and so I'm very proud of my little, I think I'll make it like a pencil or pen holder. So maybe I have a new hobby in front of me, because I love ceramics, but I've never made my own before. So I think we can jump right in, and want to give a little bit of context and then hand things over to you guys. Today, more than 5 million people are living with Alzheimer's. And I think it's really astonishing when you think about how this number is expected to grow. So by 2050, expected to grow to 14 million. And as you can see, by 2034, we expect older adults to outnumber kids for the first time in our history. And so we want to make sure that you all know that this is an interactive webinar. And so we are going to be, I just wanted to kind of set the stage that we are going to be asking the panelists questions, taking your own questions, and then launching some polls throughout. So that is kind of more to come on that. But I wanted to kind of, I think, pass things over to Wen initially. When we think about this wave of the aging of the baby boomers, kind of the impact that is going to have, some are referring to it as the silver tsunami. Wondering if you could set the stage for us a bit when you think about the needs, the primary needs of the aging baby boomer population, and do you think that we're currently set up to meet the needs of that population?
Sure, happy to go over that. And just let me know if my audio is cutting out still. So when we talk about the baby boomers, we have to keep in mind that this includes people ranging from 55 years old to 75 years old. And we have to remember that people who are in this wide age range, they're going to have different needs. For example, a healthy 55-year-old is going to have different needs than a healthy 75-year-old, who's going to have different needs than an unhealthy 55-year-old. So age is not the only factor. And at a very high level, a very simple way I like to segment the population, whether it's for healthcare needs or for just product needs, what I like to do is think about what is the individual's cognitive function, such as do they have dementia, do they have cognitive impairment? And then I also like to look at their physical function, such as mobility impairments. Are they able to walk? Are they able to drive? Are they able to, use their arms and their shoulders? Another type of physical function is more of a sensory impairment, such as tasting, seeing, hearing, and these affect communication and socialization. So companies that want to offer products or services to seniors really need to do a nuanced analysis of your target market and identify what are the specific pain points for each segment and what are the solutions that are acceptable to these end users. So the other thing with the senior market that's important to remember is keep in mind the end user is not always the senior. Sometimes it's the children or the relatives. Sometimes it's professionals like doctors, nurses, home health aides. So that's another aspect to keep in mind. And ultimately, when an individual develops significant cognitive or physical impairment, that's usually when a family has to get involved, and it becomes very challenging for the families to juggle their own lives and to juggle caregiving, and it often leads to burnout. And usually the physical disability or dementia is what triggers the loss of independence and ultimately moving into a nursing home or assisted living facility, which is often very expensive. So any solutions that can offset this cost of care or to prevent the cognitive or physical decline would be very impactful. So a little bit more context that I just wanted to share from my geriatrics perspective is that I just wanted to point out that cognitive impairment has many different causes, and not all cognitive impairment is dementia. So for example, within cognitive impairment, they're at a very high level. And I just wanted to give a caveat that these, the sizes of these circles are not market sizes. This is just more of a conceptual diagram just to help organize the thoughts. So, you know, depression can cause people to not remember well. Delirium, which is more of an acute fluctuation, especially with COVID, is another cause of cognitive impairment. And I also wanted to point out that besides cognitive impairment, there are other things that masquerade as cognitive impairment. For example, someone who might have earwax in their ears, they can't hear well. So when their grandkids are talking to them, they'll be like, what? Or they're answering the wrong thing. And you might think, oh, grandpa's just, you know, going senile, or, you know, grandpa's got dementia, but maybe they just have a hearing impairment because of age or because of earwax. Other sorts of medical conditions can also cause, you know, altered mental status and change in the ability for the brain to function well, which I believe Elli and others are going to talk more about later as well. So now that leads me to really getting into dementia. There's many different types, but the most common types are Alzheimer's, stroke, and Lewy body. And I wanted to mention this because oftentimes when we talk about dementia or cognitive impairment, we focus just on Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's, while it is one of the most common forms, it is not the only problem to tackle, and it's not the only thing that needs solutioning. And last but not least, there's Lewy body is related to Parkinson's disease, and then there's also people who fall outside of formal dementia, where they have some memory or, you know, brain impairment, but it's not really affecting their lives on a day-to-day basis yet. So with that, I just wanted to say, you know, it's really important to distinguish the different types of underlying causes. And I'm really hoping the new digital tools and other innovations will help distinguish what is the underlying cause for each individual and how we can help prevent it or treat it going forward. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate the perspective on kind of the full complexity and landscape, moving beyond kind of just talking about Alzheimer's. Super helpful. And actually, I think we want to pull up our first polling question just to get a sense for, you know, how has what Wen's talking about impacted those on the line. So hopefully you all see the poll question that we just popped up. But the question is, have you ever known someone who has had dementia? So if you could go ahead and kind of take a few moments to answer that question, and then we'll go ahead and close it and see and kind of see the results. So I'm curious to get your reactions as well, but that's pretty astonishing that over 80% of the people on the line have known someone who has had dementia. I think it just shows how much of an impact this is having either on ourselves at some point in our lives or folks that we love. Are you guys surprised by these results? Yeah.
No.
I mean, you know, I can say I would actually have expected an even slightly higher number. I think, you know, what we see now is that the disease, just the prevalence rates are so high that it's really rare to meet somebody who hasn't known anyone who has had some form of dementia.
And Christina, I did want to kind of move to you because I think there are so many complex problems to solve in healthcare, and really curious to hear more about why Gates Ventures decided to focus on Alzheimer's, and what are some of the breakthroughs that you're either already seeing or those that you hope to see in the future?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So for our team, the focus on Alzheimer's disease actually came out of an analysis that was looking at what are the biggest cost drivers for the US healthcare system. And so from that work, Alzheimer's disease was very high on the list, but was also the leading cause of death in the US that doesn't have any meaningful treatments, but is also becoming more prevalent over time. So the key takeaway being that unless Alzheimer's disease and dementia are addressed in some form, the burden on the US healthcare system will very quickly become unsustainable. And so for me, on a personal note, like most of you, my grandfather suffers from Alzheimer's disease. So his diagnosis and care has also been a big driver for me personally. But towards your second question in terms of breakthroughs, I think there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic. We actually got news just today about the first blood test for Alzheimer's disease becoming available, which is super exciting. And there's been a lot of activity in that space and new data coming out. So I think this will be just the start in terms of being able to detect Alzheimer's disease with kind of low cost and minimally invasive approaches. So we're really excited about that. I guess the other thing I would mention in terms of a blood test as a breakthrough, I think we view it as potentially really catalytic for the field as a whole, because up until now, patients are diagnosed with dementia or mild cognitive impairment based on their symptoms. But unless you do a very expensive PET scan or an invasive lumbar puncture, you won't know what's actually causing the disease. So having a blood test would not only help patients know biologically what's going on, but would also really help clinical trials by more efficiently enrolling the right patients and reducing the number of patients that you have to screen to get into your trials.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And I think what we can't ignore this year as well is the context that we're talking about this topic in, which is in this global pandemic. I think it's certainly accelerated some of the trends that we have or will be talking about, shifting more care virtually or at home, unfortunately seeing, I think, more gaps in care, especially for some of these patients, and just having more of an awareness of the mental health of our population. And Elli, I wanted to ask that, what are the major shifts that you're seeing and how have they impacted how you're approaching your business and your customers?
It's a great question, Megan, and thank you. I think that the silver lining of COVID has been greater use of telemedicine and virtual solutions for both delivering and being able to access care. And even, we've seen that seniors have become much more comfortable with using laptops or using their smartphone to reach a doctor and to get some kind of, healthcare need addressed. The deep downside of COVID, among, many, many other things, is that the isolation that has occurred as a result of needing to shelter in place and to quarantine has accelerated all kinds of other risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So things like depression can be a trigger for Alzheimer's. Certainly being more isolated, not being able to see friends and loved ones has created a lot of situations in which there are serious mental health issues in place. I would say another, downside is that we've seen that COVID has disproportionately impacted African Americans and Hispanics. What we know about Alzheimer's is that African Americans and people of color are often disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's disease. So, I think there's going to be a huge fallout in the Alzheimer's space as a result of COVID. one of the other things that we've seen as a result directly to those who have been affected by COVID is that there is some kind of, brain fog that seems to occur at the, for those who've been affected by COVID, but then also just those who are being socially isolated. But we've seen one of the ramifications of those people severely affected by COVID is having some type of cognitive decline that's associated with it. In terms of how that is affecting our business, I think it's helpful because it validates what we already know, which is that this is a disease that impacts many, many people, and the need for care couldn't be greater. And the means for getting that care, as you mentioned, there are huge gaps in care around being able to just get tested and get any sort of preventive program put in place. So, we're pushing into a lot of those areas where there are gaps, and I think we'll be able to address a huge need that, in some ways existed already and in other ways has been exacerbated by COVID.
Yeah. And I just to the audience, we see your questions coming in, so we're queuing them up. We will get to them. Thank you for your engagement. I did want to talk a bit about, do you see a shift happening? We've talked already about kind of better diagnostics, but we're talking about cognitive decline. And so how far upstream can we go in terms of monitoring that decline and shifting from kind of diagnosis of that when it's pretty acute to prevention? And I'm curious, what is that a paradigm shift? What does that look like? And when I wanted to start with you, just to get a sense of the status quo from the perspective of the medical community and how the medical community is approaching dementia.
Sure. So the status quo in the medical community is the recommendation is to generally not screen people early for dementia, because the belief is that it doesn't change management. So if someone were to get dementia when they're 70, but now they're 40, 50, or 60, and I tell you, in 10 years or 20 years from now, you're going to have Alzheimer's, is it going to really make a difference if there's no cure? That's really the fundamental status quo within the medical community. And also from an ethics perspective, there's this concern where if you label someone early on in life as having a certain disease, does that mean we've given up on them, or we don't offer them the same opportunities during the interim time, because we know that in a future time they're going to, die of some horrible condition or something like that. The other aspect related to all this is, even though there are multiple dementia drugs on the market, they're overall not that effective. They overall don't have a huge sustained improvement in dementia progression. It's really just alleviating symptoms temporarily. And so the candidates in the research pipeline, many of them have failed as well, just because it is very difficult to target something in the brain without affecting all the other parts of the brain. So that's kind of the status quo. And I think that with the newer biomarkers and digital phenotyping, I do think that this can help us point out who might be specific subsets of people, whether it's dementia or other types of related conditions, and who are these subsets of people that do have something that can be treated or that can be improved or prevented. So it's really moving towards more of the digital personalized medicine realm, where you're looking at non-traditional markers, non-traditional blood tests, imaging tests, digital tests, and also really ultimately, hopefully prevent people from having dementia.
Yeah, and I just noticed you used the word non-traditional a few times there, and I'm like, how does the non-traditional approach butt up against the status quo of the medical community, right? So, Elli, wondering if you could speak to just systemically from a culture perspective, what needs to happen to get from kind of the focus on we're going to diagnose for this late because we can't treat it to thinking about earlier prevention and management?
It's a great question. I mean, and that therein lies the rub, right? With so many digital health companies, you've got these disruptive technologies butting up against an industry that has very entrenched stakeholders that are used to doing things the same way. And there's a big argument for continuing for some of those things to operate in the same way. But at the same time, what we now know about Alzheimer's disease is very different from what was the status quo even just a few years ago. There are large randomized controlled trials that have been validating new protocols for prevention and looking at the role that lifestyle plays in preventing, whatever you want to call it, delaying symptoms, reducing your risk for Alzheimer's. And that body of evidence is becoming overwhelming. We have huge trials that are going on all over the country, all over the world, including in the US, and now finally for the first time, one that is being paid for and supported by the Alzheimer's Association. I think what we've found as a digital health company is that you've got to be able to take your new innovative solution and approach healthcare, using their own language and meeting them in a place in terms of validating your science or validating your technology in the way that it ought to be if you're going to take it to market. And so, I think, as it relates to prevention, we still have a little bit of a ways to go before I think it would be widely viewed as settled science in the same way that, if you take like the diabetes prevention program is validated. But when and so that may be how healthcare, broadly speaking, or conservative physicians may view it. When you take it to an individual whose mother or father or grandparent is starting to show signs of cognitive decline, and there's a family history or a concern there, they'll do whatever it takes. And so the fact that, you may not have 25 years of RCTs backing it up, you only have, say, 10 or 7, which is what we now have. I think that there's an openness and a deep desire to incorporate those changes into their own lifestyles. I will say, though, I was listening in on a webinar yesterday that James Park was doing from Fitbit, and the major payers are now incentivizing their members to do things like start wearing a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. I think that there is a growing movement or understanding that that prevention is something that is critical. And there are all kinds of new tools that people can use in order to prevent. And because there's the potential for so much cost savings around, impacting Alzheimer's disease, impacting cardiovascular disease, impacting diabetes, they're willing to, I think, for the first time, really get behind a lot of these new technologies with the hope that it will have an ROI that they haven't seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. And we had a question come up from, Wen, go ahead, please. Yes.
I just wanted to quickly piggyback off that. So the most common forms of dementia are Alzheimer's and vascular dementia, and oftentimes people have both. They have a mixture of both. And, Elli talked about preventing the Alzheimer's type, but I also wanted to mention the vascular type is basically when someone has strokes or mini strokes, and it's the same disease process as having a heart attack. People often call it a brain attack because it's basically when the blood vessels in your brain get clogged up and it chokes off the blood supply to your brain, then you have brain damage from that. So I'm mentioning that because today is World Stroke Day, and preventing strokes and stroke-related causes of dementia is very doable by healthy living, improving your blood pressure, improving your cholesterol. So any sort of interventions that help the overall health are going to help the brain health.
Mm-hmm. It's so connected. And I was going to bring up just one of the questions that we've gotten from the audience, which was for Christina, which is, how is the Gates Foundation thinking about non-invasive real-world evidence for Alzheimer's screening? And can you explain a little bit more about that blood test that you were talking about, which institution it's from. Yeah, I'll start with those.
Yeah, sure. So the blood test is being commercialized by C2N, but it also comes out of Washington University in St. Louis. I think I saw someone link an article in a Q&A response. In terms of like real world evidence and screening in the real world, so one of our initiatives is a program called the Diagnostics Accelerator that is a partnership with the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. And our objective is to fund researchers, both academic and for-profit companies, developing novel biomarkers for Alzheimer's related dementias. And so we have two focus areas. One is around peripheral fluid markers like a blood test, and the second area is around just so much activity. It's honestly overwhelming, but there's also so much potential in terms of using these ubiquitous devices that are now kind of everywhere and able to collect passive continuous data streams that we have not had before. So it's certainly in its early stages, and there's a lot to still figure out of what are the best data streams and how do we capitalize and how can we turn that into clinically useful information. But I think there's going to be just a ton coming out of this space and a ton that we can learn from in terms of using this data that is minimally invasive in terms of intervening in the patient's life, but also translating that into something that's very clinically useful and links back to, I think, some of the prevention conversations we're talking about.
Yeah, I think one thread is like, we're just learning so much across all stages of this. And go ahead, because I was going to segue into the next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly comment on what Kristina mentioned about the continuous data streams. I think it's really exciting where we are now today compared to 5 or 10 years ago because of the computational power of AI and machine learning. There is the ability to really process a large amount of data, and not just one type of data set, but look at genomics, radiology imaging, the continuous Fitbit monitors, what are people's moods, how are people moving around. And so I really think there is an opportunity now that wasn't available, even 3 or 4 years ago because of the advances in computing power.
Yeah. And we got a question, which I think does relate to this concept of we are learning so much and we have a lot more computational power to understand kind of what's happening earlier. We can analyze a lot more data points, but the question is around kind of like, are we going to see payers covering the costs of these things as they're being developed? So the question is kind of appreciating that Alzheimer's, and I'll say dementia, exists along a wide spectrum with pathology occurring occurring over the course potentially of a decade. Do you envision that payers are going to cover the cost of digital services and solutions that are working more on the prevention side of things?
I can answer that one. I saw the question about payers reimbursing for cognitive tests, and they do. Now there are a number of codes that will reimburse for cognitive testing, for the interpretation of those tests, and then for care planning. There's universal coverage from Medicare for that, and then many of the private payers also cover it. On the prevention side, one of the great things, I suppose, silver linings of COVID is that there's been, and just, other changes with CMS in the past couple of years, is that there are all kinds of new codes for reimbursing or paying for behavioral health types of interventions. And some of the prevention work can fall in under those codes. But, I think, we may be a couple of years away from a designated premium price code for reimbursing for prevention for Alzheimer's disease. Specifically, if you look back at what happened with the DPP, it took many, many years before there were codes for that.
Yeah.
And also, from having worked in health plans, the emphasis is really on what's the financial ROI within 1 year time frame, maybe 2 years at most. And so when you're talking about anything that's preventive health that's going to help someone 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, that health insurance company is not going to, if they invest in a wonderful program to make you healthy and happy, they're not necessarily going to feel the benefits of that investment, because people change health insurance plans. And especially nowadays, because, you know, it used to be people were very tied to their employer-based plan. And even when they retired, they were still under the same plan. But now, you know, people change jobs, and also employers are switching their benefits providers every year. So.
Yeah. I think that's interesting too, Wen, because I know you kind of consult with companies that are building kind of B2B models, but also direct to consumer. And I think what you're saying, plus what Elli, what you said earlier about just if you're the caregiver or family member of someone with this, you're going to have a huge motivation to gain access to this type of solution for your loved one. And so I think it does bring up some questions around what's kind of the right business model in this space. I mean, that's always the big nut to crack in digital health, but wondering if you all, just from your experience, whether with your own companies you've seen, who you've consulted with, like, is there a right way, or are there kind of many ways that are being tested in terms of bringing these types of solutions to market?
I think it's more the latter, many different ways that are being tested. I mean, you know, the issue with healthcare is that by and large, people are used to someone else paying for their healthcare, an insurer, and only having out-of-pocket costs related to deductibles and those sorts of things. We've seen a shift in that. You know, there are now many direct-to-consumer healthcare companies like Lemonade Health. You know, there's the big Roman Hims and Hers. You know, there are many that are out there, and I think that people are now getting very comfortable accessing health care products and technologies directly, and not necessarily going to their PCP to get access. I think that's going to take a little while longer for seniors or for an older demographic to really feel comfortable, you know, discovering something on the web and then accessing it themselves directly, especially if they are on a Medicare or Medicare Advantage plan. That said, they may have children, older adult children, who are very comfortable with that and can help socialize it. But, you know, I think, you know, back to your primary question, I think we're still going to see that there are lots of different ways to take this to market, and you've got to work both in an ecosystem, you know, with traditional stakeholders, and then, you know, there may be some direct-to-consumer opportunities down the road.
And I think because we've... Oh, go ahead, Christina.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think we've seen kind of the same thing of there's a lot of different models people are trying. I don't think one is tried and true yet. One way we've been thinking about segmenting just the types of business models we're looking at is, you know, the primary customer. Is it the direct-to-consumer model? Is it direct to a physician, or the physician is your end customer, or is it from a or somewhere in between where you're kind of cross? And so I think there's, within Alzheimer's, there has been a lot of focus on the pharma as your customer model, which I think has been super interesting, especially as we deal with these questions of what do you do if you diagnose a patient and you don't have a treatment for them? Well, by targeting the research market, you can kind of get around that problem a little bit. And pharma is also finding a lot of value in partnering with these tools.
And I think because we've kind of brought up the just the accessibility and the access channels for these types of solutions, would love to bring up our next. We're going to give you 2 polling questions in one, but the first is going to ask you: has your doctor ever spoken to you about your brain health or cognitive performance? And then the second: have you ever taken a cognitive assessment? So trying to gauge, and I think someone did point out, like, this is a self-selected group who decided to come to a webinar on this topic. So the results are certainly not representative of the general population, but curious among this group of, 300 or so folks on the line, is this something that has been integrated into your care yet? So we'll just wait a few moments for the results. So Elli, I think I said I was interested in getting your take on these results. So it sounds like, the vast majority of people have not spoken to their doctor, or their doctor has not spoken to them specifically about brain health. Also want to dig in with this group a little bit about that term brain health. And most have not taken a cognitive assessment.
Not surprised. I actually think the number of people who've taken a cognitive assessment test is a little bit higher than I would have anticipated. This is one of the biggest issues that we are facing, and Wen probably deals with this all the time, which is just these massive gaps in care, lack of access to doctors who will test them, or even will raise the issue of their brain health or cognition. And in my view, it's a travesty. I mean, I think the fact that the brain is, we can argue over which is the most important organ in the body, but I mean, certainly the brain ranks pretty high up there. And the fact that the majority of primary care doctors do not ever raise the question, I think is outrageous. And then when asked, there was a poll in the Washington Post many years ago now, like probably 4 or 5 years ago, that did a survey of primary care docs and asked them whether they raised brain health. If they did they give a cognitive test? And if they gave a cognitive test and the results were bad, did they tell their patient about it? Mm-hmm. And the number of docs who actually raised brain health was very low. Of that number, the number that gave a cognitive test was even lower. And then the worst part about it was that for those doctors, and Wen touched on this earlier, for those doctors who did either give a cognitive test or just through, observing the patient could see that there was some cognitive impairment, didn't raise it for precisely the reason that there isn't a drug. But, to me, if you take that paradigm and shift it to any other disease space, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, can you imagine if you walked into your doctor, they knew you had cancer and they didn't tell you? So I think that it's a real disservice that we're doing to people by not making cognitive testing accessible, by not talking about brain health. And I think that there's tremendous need for really educating both individuals as well as the provider community about the importance of this.
One question that we got earlier that I think is relevant to what you're saying, it's almost a bit more of a philosophical question about just kind of what is cognitive decline versus like natural aging. And the question is, I was wondering how one would walk the fine line of creating tools to help tackle Alzheimer's and dementia and other cognitive disorders, but also make sure you're not pathologizing the natural progression of healthy aging and decline. And Christina, I actually wanted to go to you because I know in prep for this call, you had talked about how like we don't really know what healthy aging looks like across our decades.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. So this actually came up a lot in a body of work our team looking at why Alzheimer's clinical trials are so challenging and why it's hard to get patients to enroll in them. And this is identified as one of the bottlenecks that are right at the top of the system, preventing patients from getting to clinical trials at the bottom. And so the issue really is that, before a patient even thinks about going to their doctor, getting screened, doing any of the downstream interactions with the healthcare system that you might expect, there is this perception of, it's just normal age-related memory loss. So, I'm not going to worry about it. And that is just creating this bottleneck of patients not going out and seeking care that they might need, but going into your healthcare system is kind of the first step. And there are all these kind of knock-on effects for the system as a whole on a downstream. So I think it's a crucial issue and one that I don't have a good answer for, other than I think this concept around how can we shift the paradigm towards brain health and just more attention to it rather than dismissing potential symptoms or issues as just kind of normal age-related loss? I think it's a really important question.
And I see we're getting a comment from one of the participants just about like, maybe we shouldn't have to expect decline. Like maybe what we should just be talking about is healthy aging, but I think we don't necessarily have the tools or access to those tools to understand, like we assume cognitive decline with aging as opposed to something that we should have checked out and could potentially get some more information or support on.
And I just wanted to add medically, so with aging, brain function and physical function is going to diminish somewhat, but it is not normal to not be able to function, to not be able to, find your way home or remember things or to just take care of yourself. So I think we do have to distinguish, what are slight lapses in memory that don't really have a significant impact versus what are things that are either affecting memory or other cognitive domains such as language, decision making, visual spatial interpretation. And also I just wanted to mention that we have to really think about just not just dismissing it as normal, but to get it checked out. Because if you look at the diagram that I have here, a lot of causes of what people think, mom or grandma is getting old and is getting dementia, a lot of that could just be like low thyroid or untreated depression or things that are super treatable. And so it's really important to just make sure all the other causes are addressed. And it goes back to what Elli was saying in terms of prevention, making sure people are, have good nutritious status, because certain vitamin deficiencies can cause dementia as well.
We did get a question about a barrier to adopting digital technologies among aging populations, being kind of their potential unfamiliarity with that technology. But, as the current baby boomer population who is increasingly familiar with tech, how do you all foresee care for this group of people changing?
I think as we started, what we're starting to see, and this is in part a result of COVID, is that people are they're being forced to use their phones or their tablets or their laptops to communicate with people, whether it's their grandkids who they can't see because they're socially isolated, or, getting a visit with a doctor who they desperately need to see. We can't discount the fact that there's using technology, but then there's also designing for this population. And so we spend a lot of time really thinking through user testing, running focus groups to make sure that everything that we design is designed with our demographic in mind. So I think it's a combination of, just people are getting more comfortable with technology just simply as a result of broader adoption, and then the need that COVID has created. But I think we're also getting much savvier about really ensuring that the products that we bring to market that are intended for this population are designed in a way that makes it much easier for them to use them.
Yeah, I love that you brought up design and designing for your user. I think we should acknowledge as a panel of 4 women that Alzheimer's does disproportionately impact women. And my understanding, 2 of 3 diagnoses are women. And so wondering, how does that potentially change how you're approaching this issue? I know we already talked a bit about kind of other equity concerns around Black and brown populations being more likely to kind of ultimately have Alzheimer's. Curious how that intersects with design as well as access.
It's design and it's access, and then it's targeting. The good news is that women tend to be much more proactive about their health. And so when they notice changes, they are not shy for the most part about raising them. and you know, and making decisions for both themselves and their family members. So if you know a spouse is also starting to show some kind of concern, then very often they can intervene. But, you know, in terms of then targeting, what we are also doing is, you know, targeting OBGYNs. Interestingly, a lot of women talk to their OBs about issues that they're experiencing in terms of their cognition. We're starting to see more and more OBs showing up at the big Alzheimer's conferences, because I think they are recognizing that this is a pressing issue for women. And if you then look at some of the recent research that's being done around the role that menopause plays in Alzheimer's disease, and there's a phenomenal PhD woman researcher at Weill Cornell by the name of Lisa Mosconi, who's written and researched this issue extensively, if anyone is interested in checking it out. But, you know, I think that really thinking about how the disease affects different groups, whether it's gender or ethnicity, is very important as we think about, you know, really creating or having an impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to jump on, I think, Megan, you mentioned also access, and I think that's a really important issue as we're talking about integrating digital technologies more to the continuum of care. And so that's something we've been thinking a lot about for our digital biomarker work around if we're trying to push these novel digital ways to detect Alzheimer's early, how can we make sure that we're doing that in a way where we can ensure broader access and equity? And so in terms of just kind of the research space, one of the ideas that a lot of our grantees have been working with is, can you offer bring your own device options for research participants to use whatever device they have, or provide a study device? Obviously, that's not as scalable when you think about an end kind of commercializable product, but I think just kind of keeping in mind this issue of access is really important as we're thinking about how can we use technology to transform this space.
And I did, because I don't know that we've gotten to the specifics yet. I did want to talk about the specifics of how is technology actually helping us detect this in ways that we haven't before. I think with Wen, we talked a bit about the kind of, with the advent of machine learning and deep learning algorithms, we can analyze a lot more data points than we traditionally could and derive insight. But, you know, are we talking about typing? Are we talking about scanning your eyesight? Are we talking about physical movement? Like what are the mechanisms that are in use now predominantly, or the things that you're really excited to see developed?
Well, I can tell you about our products, which is technology that is based on eye tracking. We use eye tracking to assess impairment in the hippocampus. And one of my co-founders, Dr. Stuart Zola, is one of the formative cognitive neuroscientists and developed our foundational IP. What we know about eye tracking is that it makes it possible to passively assess all kinds of things going on with the user. Not only can we predictively understand someone's risk for Alzheimer's, and by identifying through one of our tests impairment in the hippocampus, but we can pick up all kinds of other things through eye tracking. There's interesting, phenomenal, very interesting data around pupil diameter and pupil dilation. We can look at things like how furrowed is somebody's brow when they're taking a test, and what does that tell us about cognitive load. So we use eye tracking in our primary test, which is a visually paired comparison test, but then we layer it in across all of our tests, and it just makes for a means of collecting data on one's cognition, and we can test across all cognitive domains that is much more accurate and of a higher quality than what has ever existed before.
Yeah, I've seen companies that do facial computer vision, like Elli was talking about. Also movement patterns, certain gaits are pathognomonic for certain conditions. Also, there are some companies that are tracking how people are using their phones, basically their digital fingerprints. And I mentioned earlier, there's some companies that have basically digitized the gold standard, like the gold standard for neuropsychological testing. There are some companies that have digitized that and validated a digital gamified version of that. So instead of, a paper and pencil test, people are playing games on an app and being able to assess their brain that way.
Yeah, I would say in addition to all of the above, one other area that we're particularly excited about is analyzing speech patterns. So not just what you say, but how you say it. And there's a lot of really cool technologies coming out using kind of a range of either kind of structured speech. So can you have a patient do those standard neuropsychiatric tests vocally and record what they're saying, or on the other end of the spectrum, can you record kind of very passively everyday conversations and from the speech patterns and on all these really analytics, you can kind of be able to detect patterns. So I think that's one other area we're particularly excited about, but in addition to everything you guys have just said too.
I know we have just a few minutes left. I wanted to land on a question that I think will be really, really actionable for a lot of people on the line. So someone's asking about kind of the healthy, normal, I'm like, what's normal anymore? Well, so we'll put it in quotes, but healthy, normal boomers, what is available to them to both assess their cognitive health and then work towards lifestyle improvements that are known to be protective of cognitive health? I think this person asked, should I just get a Fitbit and move more? Are there other things? Like what is the kind of explicit recommendation right now?
Well, if you go to Neurotrack's website, www.neurotrack.com, we have just launched a massive library of validated evidence-based articles that are very easy to read and accessible that will tell you everything that you need to do from a prevention perspective, and then sign up for on our mailing list, and we can get you access to cognitive testing in the next couple of months.
Great. Really, really appreciate you all joining. And Christina, Elli, Wen, it's been such a pleasure chatting today.
Thank you, Megan. This is great.
Thanks for having us.
Everybody at Rock Health.
And thanks for all those who attended.
Thanks, guys.